This is Lance Mabus. I'll be covering Chapter 16 from our Northouse text, Culture and Leadership, for our Leadership Perspectives and Practices class. So, before we get started talking about all of the different cultures in the world and the ways to define them, let's just play a quick game. So, the game is, can we recognize universally desirable or undesirable leadership traits? I call it the DUH game, for desirable or undesirable. Communicative, desirable. Egocentric, undesirable. Positive, gotta be desirable. Trustworthy, desirable. Ruthless, undesirable. Right off the bat, when we hear these words, when we think about them as traits of a person or as a leader, we know right away what we're thinking. But can we have a research framework to back up those instincts? And in order to do that, let's set the stage for the problem of studying culture and leadership. And it's a big stage, and there are some problems that we run into. And the first is that the world is very big, and to steal a quote from Douglas Adams, you just won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big it is. I mean, you may think it's a long way down the road to the chemist, but that's just peanuts. And he was talking about space, but it applies to the globe as well. And on that globe, we have another problem. There's lots of people to try to understand. In fact, right now, there's about 7.8 billion of us. And all of those people can now communicate nearly instantaneously. So just a fun chart here showing that walking is a very slow way to deliver a message from one side of the world to the other. We're actually closing in on the light speed limit, which is about a quarter of a second to send a message via light all the way around the world. So what is this chapter about? What's the central thesis? And the central thesis is culture is important for leading in an era of globalization. And then they talk about the challenges that globalization has created for leaders. Some of them are straightforward. Communicating within organizations with culturally diverse employees, that's a challenge. And how do you meet those challenges? You develop cross-cultural competencies. So that's what this chapter is all about. How do you understand culture, and how do you lead knowing what you know about culture? Speaking of which, what is culture? Culture is the learned beliefs, values, rules, norms, symbols, and traditions that are common to a group of people. For the scientists among us, we might wonder, how do you measure culture? And that was the domain of Hofstede. As a researcher, he categorized culture into 5 dimensions. You see them there, which we can do better than that. The GLOBE research program, which GLOBE stands for Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness Program, they came up with 9 dimensions by which you can categorize culture, or different cultures. And once they did that, you need to understand a little bit about each. Power distance, expectation and agreement that power should be shared unequally, uncertainty avoidance, the use of rules, laws, and structures to make things predictable, institutional collectivism, the degree to which an organization or society encourages institutional or societal collective action, whether in-group collectivism, whether people express pride, loyalty, and cohesiveness in their organizations and families, gender egalitarianism, how much society de-emphasizes members' biological sex in determining an individual's role in society, assertiveness, whether or not a society encourages people to be forceful and aggressive in social relationships as opposed to timid and submissive, future orientation, whether or not people engage in planning, investing in the future, and delaying gratification. I found it interesting that the Nordic and Germanic cultural clusters are high future orientation. Maybe that has to do with the climate of those regions as those cultures developed, where if you weren't planning ahead and winter came, to allude to Game of Thrones, you did not survive. Performance orientation, a society that improves performance and excellence. Humane orientation, a society that rewards others for being fair and kind to other members of society. One thing I'd like to go back to here, if we have the time, maybe we can discuss what happened with WeWork, and was there a breakdown in that uncertainty avoidance that led to some of those issues there. Could be fun discussion, but those are the dimensions. So how many cultural clusters exist? And the Globe Research Program identified 10 regional clusters by which they could categorize the world. That's right, 10 regional clusters, one for each finger, which is a critique of the Globe Research Program that's come out recently, that the entire Indian subcontinent is categorized as Southern Asia, and that perhaps we could do a little better than that. So maybe we'll have to start using some toes. But that's not a lot. That's not a lot. And in fact, if there are 30 people in this room in our class, we amount to just a very, very tiny percentage of the global population, 0.0000039%. But I bet we represent about 50% of these clusters culturally, which is a fairly large percentage considering how few of us there are. And what do we do with that? What do we do with that information now that we've categorized the world into something manageable? Well, the first thing we do is we study those people and what are their characteristics, and when we apply that to leadership, we're talking about our followers then. So we take some of the ideas from followership and apply it. One example I thought of was if a follower comes from a low assertiveness culture, they might have difficulty being an exemplary follower from the Kelly model. They might not challenge their leaders with constructive ideas. And of course, this is a leadership course, so we want to understand what leaders can do too, and what behaviors followers are looking for from their leaders. And Globe identified 6 global leadership behaviors. You see them there, and they found that those 6 behaviors were valued differently by different cultural clusters. So we can see here that for Eastern Europe, autonomous leadership, very important. For Latin America, autonomous leadership, not so important. So, leaders, and there's some implications there. If you're running a global business and you want to transfer a leader from your Eastern European division to a Latin American division, you might have to provide that leader some training, some cultural training, so they understand their role or what their followers might expect of them. But there are some things that we can look to as universal traits of leadership, and that's probably one of the most important findings from Globe's studies, is that across all cultures, there are universally desired leadership attributes. And if you can, if your followers generate, this word cloud, like when they describe you, that's a good thing. And vice versa, if they're generating this word cloud over here when they describe your leadership style and actions, probably a bad thing. And we played that game right at the outset of the presentation, and you see those words and you think, yeah, of course being trustworthy is desirable, but Globe actually has the research to back that up. So there are practical implications for what we've found in the Culture and Leadership chapter. Before you dive into those practical applications, you need to understand that the Globe studies are expansive and well-researched, so you can go to the bank with them. And when you do that, that means that you can classify people based on the cultures they come from, and that's useful. It also found that there are universal desirable and undesirable traits for leaders. That's got huge practical implications. It means you can build leadership studies that use those concepts and say, hey, use these 22, find a way to be a leader that is characterized by these 22 attributes. You can include this information in new employee orientation programs. We already talked about how relocation training could be impacted by this information, And of course, if you're merging companies across cultures and across nations, you know, you need that information. We didn't talk about some of the info that the chapter covered. Two big concepts we didn't hit on were ethnocentrism and prejudice. You know, and they're just the idea that people tend to find their own cultures as because they're used to them as superior. So you need to expand beyond that and expand beyond your prejudices to be a global leader. So certainly worth digging into in more depth. But to conclude, let's think about how valuable these 10 research clusters are. We can take 780 million people approximately and put them into a cultural cluster and understand them. You know, if we're dividing the world's population into those 10 cultural clusters, and I'm sure there's some asymmetries in how they're distributed, but that gives you a sense of how those people act, and you can use that information, and that brings us to the end.